we cannot have our own agenda and then tie it to other people's own personal interest. So I think it's where African politicians and our policy makers will need to draw between the line and know where we need to stand, or else it's going to be like that forever.
Hello and welcome to our final edition of the COP’29 coverage on Green Group TV. As the dust has settled on COP’29 that was held in Baku, Azerbaijan, today we're going to dive deep into the outcomes of the recently concluded conference, where we had world leaders, activists, and climate experts all gathered to shape the future of our planet. And so key questions and reactions have emerged at the end of this conference. Many are disappointed, many are even livid, and others still hopeful. It was a debate of whether financial commitments made rose to the challenge, or did they leave vulnerable nations still fighting uphill? Joining me to unpack these outcomes are Benjamin Isaiah, Executive Director, Center for Environmental Management and Sustainable Energy, and Henry Tamba Nyuma, Executive Director, Partners for Climate Change and Sustainable Agricultural Development. How are you all doing? It's good to have you join us on the program. How are you doing, Benjamin?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. Benjamin Isaiah is the name.
Oh, it's Sia. Okay, sorry. I was hoping I'll get the pronunciation correctly. Okay, Sia. All right, got it. All right. So let's just get right into the conversation. We'll start with the very big headlines and the big elephant that was in the room. That's the $300 billion finance deal that they laid on the table at COP’29. How do you assess this finance deal? Because aside the fact that it was far below the 1.3 trillion that was requested from developing nations, a lot of reactions have even stemmed from economists that are saying that this finance deal does not take into consideration inflation, because it says that by 2035, what they laid on the table as $300 billion would actually amount to $368 billion. So aside the fact that this deal is far short of the 1.3 trillion, it seems like the deal doesn't even match up to the number that they gave by 2035. So I just want to hear your thoughts on the deal that was set on the table for $300 billion to help developing nations tackle climate change. How do you assess this deal? What's your response to this proposal that was made at COP’29?
The developed nations or advanced nations are not committed to the fight against climate change. They always put lip services. They always use lip services in terms of committing resources. By the end of the day, they don't put a lot of resources needed to mitigate and also adapt to this particular challenge. Africa and other developing countries or other constituencies around the world are the major hit when it comes to climate change. And our projections are that Africa needs about $190 billion annually. Now, $190 billion annually to be able to mitigate and also adapt to climate change. If you are talking about 300 billion, then we are talking about 60. Africa only will take about 63% of the whole 300 billion that has been allocated to impacting countries to mitigate and also adapt to this particular situation. So we think that the global north or advanced countries are not committed. They are just giving us lip services and not interested in issues of climate change, adaptation, as well as mitigation. If you look at the inflows in Africa, West Africa and East Africa are major constituencies that benefit from large of the inflows. And if you put Africa together, we get 28% of the inflows that we expect to get, which means we lose year on year, we lose almost 72% of what is needed to mitigate and also adapt to climate change. Our various NDCs that we've come out with has budgets for them. I was looking at the Nigerian NDC, which was ballooning almost about $122 billion to almost $177 billion. So if countries alone are expecting these huge sums of funds or grants or arrangements or certain trades to be able to mitigate and adapt, and the global north goes to give us 300 billion, we think that they are not committed to the fight against climate change, and African governments must come strongly at them that if we are not able to meet certain targets by 2030, then it is not the fault of African countries, but the fault of the global north, because Africa really emits less. As we speak, Africa does about 3% of global emission. China does about 35% of global emission. US doing higher levels of emission, but we suffer the most. So if we as a constituency, and Latin America and other developing countries are the most sufferers of the impact of climate change due to higher temperatures, droughts that is causing a lot of food insecurity in Africa, a lot of illnesses that hitherto were not observed in Africa. That means that our government and our ministers who attend some of these meetings must be strong enough and bold enough to tell the global north that they are not ready. And if they are not ready, then we must all engage in emitting a lot so that at the end of the day, they also have this impact that Africa is also feeling.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So let me come to you now, Henry, still on the topic of the $300 billion deal that was laid on the table. We've come to learn that this deal is not just grants, it's also a mix of loans. So it's a mix of grants and loans, the deal that they proposed. Do you think this is fair? Do you think this is a fair approach, especially considering that most of these developing nations are already in debt? They're already burdened by servicing debts and trying to develop their economy. And now we learned that the $300 billion deal not only fell short of our request, but it's also coming in loans as well. So how do you assess this response by the developing nations as regards this particular situation?
Yeah, I think in the composition of this particular $300 billion, where grants from maybe national and multinational companies, as well as bilateral arrangements between governments and agencies within state, we think that it is not in the best interest of suffering constituencies like Africa, in the sense that most of our constituents, especially CSOs and CBOs in Africa, do not even know the arrangement within which they can attract some of these loans from development partners. We do not also know the arrangement within which we can attract some of these grants, and loans come with interest that we are going to pay to these development partners. In any case, they are emitting more. So if they are emitting more, we should see this particular $300 billion as a total corporate social responsibility of the global north to the global south, and not add any loan imposition which affects our ability to pay back. As we speak, the impact of COVID has brought many African economies to their knees. In recent times, Ghana, for example, in COVID hit us and we're growing around 1%. And this year we are growing around 2.8 to 3%, depending on how the year ends. So if you look at the growth projection of many African countries are suffering. And if African countries are suffering and you want them to borrow or access loan to be able to fight and mitigate climate change, we think that it is not going to serve the interest of Africa, because already most of these countries are in debt crisis. For example, Ghana's debt to GDP is hovering around 84 to almost 95%. We are in debt crisis. If you take Nigeria may also be in debt crisis. Just I don't have the actual figures. Nigeria may be in debt crisis. Most of the sub-Saharan African countries are in debt crisis. So if we want to mitigate and adapt to support the global north to be able to industrialize and grow, it means that they must give us this $300 billion as total grant that becomes a corporate social responsibility on their part to support us mitigate, and not giving us as loans. So at the end of the day, they are going to benefit a lot from this particular $300 billion grant, and not Africa. We are the sufferers, and we should not be giving loans as handouts. And that is why sometimes I have a challenge with our ministers and also government agencies who attend some of these conferences. Look as if we go there with a lower stand, or maybe a lower requirement of these Western nations, until India and China came in to speak for some African countries. African countries normally go there without mouth to talk. We must tell them that no, $300 billion must be fully granted, even though it's inadequate. We must call for a lot of more than this $300 billion dollars. And if you are calling for more than $300 billion, then it also means that it must be total grant that supports the mitigation and adaptation measures of African countries, and not loans that also bring us to what we call energy poverty and other poverty situations that also impact us deadly.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So, Henry, let me come to you now. I also want to hear your thoughts on that as well. How do you assess this deal that the developing nations has proposed to us? Benjamin has already, I mean, according to Benjamin, from his own assessment, we can see that he is saying that the developing nations are not committed based on this proposal that they've laid down. So I also want to hear your thoughts on this, considering that they're giving us these inadequate funds, even as loans and not even grants. What are your thoughts on that as well?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry for the breakthrough during the connection phase of the meeting. Firstly, is that this should be a social corporate responsibility on the part of the global north, because they are the more polluters and we are the victims, so to speak. All of the environmental consequences point towards the global south. So I think it's quite unfair, and Africans should be given even more than what has been given, and it should be given as part of their corporate social corporate responsibility. And another thing I've come to realize over the years with this issue of climate change and the various meetings that have been held, most of these meetings, if not all of them, have been held outside of Africa. So how can you solve a problem when you're not in the area where the problem is being created? So the climate change impact is mostly felt in the developing countries, Africa, Asia, and so to speak. But the meetings are held in countries that are more of the polluters. So I don't think they have the ability to grasp the actuality on the ground. So what if we have the meeting around somewhere, the Sahel region, in Chad or somewhere there where the impact of climate change is really felt, or in some other countries within Asia or Southeast Asia where the impact of desertification is real, or where there are pollution in some of those rivers or water bodies like the Niger Delta, where the issue of pollution from oil production. I think if we have meetings in these areas, these guys will come to terms to see the reality of what is going on. And another thing is that the custodian of our natural resources, the farmers, the villagers, you rarely find them attending these meetings when our African delegations. I think there's a mismatch of attendance during these meetings, because most often we see politicians, policymakers, religious leaders, or other guys who are at the higher echelon of power in Africa attend these meetings, or really find indigenous attending this meeting. And for that, I think we have an issue here.
Okay, so now still on that, now looking at the amount that was laid down, and now you've spoken about people that attended and all of that, but aside that, there was also a debate as regards the redefining of developing nations, because now some people feel that if, for instance, a country like China had been termed as a developed nation, maybe and aside China, even other developing nations as well that have strong economies, that if they were put on that same pedestal with the global north leaders, maybe the finances that we had would have been better. So do you think that towards the next COP, or consequently, there needs to be a redefining of developing nations in order to achieve more equitable climate finance contributions? What do you think about that?
Yes, obviously, there's a need for redefining or creating a status or categorization of the, so to speak, developing nations, developed nation, and whatever it is. And I think it's quite unfair to some extent, because take, for example, in terms of natural resources, contribution to the global economy, we have some countries in Africa that are contributing more in terms of natural resources. So by what standard are they categorizing these nations as developing or underdeveloped, whatever it is? So it's something to look at. It needs to be redefined, obviously.
All right, thank you very much. So let me come back to you, Benjamin. Now let's leave out from the finance talk. Let's go to the talk on the fossil fuel phase out. Unfortunately, at COP’29, they were unable to come to an agreement on the fossil fuel phase out because it didn't seem like there was a lot of resistance on that particular discussion at the conference. Why do you think this was the case? And then what more do you think we need to do towards COP30 to ensure that we're able to reach a final decision on this fossil fuel transition as well towards, a more renewable energy sources in our energy sector? What do you think we need to do in that aspect?
Well, before I go to the question you just asked, I think I must also add that we need to redefine what developed and developing nations are. And maybe we define these terms in the early 90s or early 80s because of IMF military rules institutions. Because today, China is the major emitter of GHGs, contributing about 35% of emissions across globe. India is also an upcoming emitter, contributed about 7.4%. So these countries in the Asia Pacific, formerly known as developing countries because they are in the global south, need to rethink. Because if China is a major emitter, then it means that China must also contribute to Africa with respect to mitigation and also adaptation. So in the next COP, we need to redefine some of these countries and then put them where they belong or where they should be, so that they can also contribute to Africa in terms of mitigation and also adaptation. Now, your next question with respect to fossil fuel, I have always said that I began by saying that the global north is not committed to the fight against climate change. They are just giving lip services, and that is so because the Russia-Ukraine conflict brought in a new supply chain for fossil fuel. Now, India is a major contributor when it comes to fossil fuel to the European market. And that also means that India burns a lot of these fuel to get refined products to this market, emitting more, right, to the international market. Most of these economies now rely on this fossil fuel because of that challenge with respect to COVID and also Russia-Ukraine conflict. Most of these economies rely on fossil fuel as a major source of revenue. So telling them to cut it off, whether in facing it down or facing it out, depending on how you look at it, will be very challenging. For example, if you come to Africa, your country, Nigeria, is a major producer of fossil fuel, and its revenue is dependent on fossil fuel. So we need to transit. But in transitions also comes with what we call stranded assets. Because these stranded assets, someone must take care of these stranded assets. Someone must pay for these stranded assets. Do we have the funds to pay for these stranded assets in Africa? No. Are the developing countries ready to support us in paying for these stranded assets? No. Are they themselves pushing away from the use of fossil fuel to other green technology or green energy? Some of them are trying, others are not. And the last part is that we must also agree that America, who is a major, today America is the largest producer of crude oil. America produces about 13.5 million liters a day, barrels a day rather. So America, which is a major contributor of fossil fuel, must also take up its own new policies in terms of phasing down the production of fossil fuel and then now venture into other green technologies that transits us from where we are now. So I think that the reason why most of these economies do not want to phase down is because they depend a lot on fossil fuel. The Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, most of them depend on this fossil fuel. So telling them to phase down will be very, very problematic. But I think that we must be very systematic in our approach and analyze the cost and benefit of transiting. Because when in Ghana, for example, we at SEMSEC conducted a study where we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis of our energy mix, whether going transition or maybe using the integration as we have it now, which one benefits the electricity user locally. And we found out that within the framework of energy integration, it benefits the electricity user more than transiting because of the issue of stranded assets and cost of newer technology that must come in. So what we want to say here is that countries are not willing to move because their economies depend on fossil fuel, and until we get new technologies that are very cheaper, very affordable, and very resilient to new environmental challenges, most of this economy will continue to rely on fossil fuel, and that is going to take a longer time because of new supply chains. India, for example, has begun to take advantage of what is happening in Ukraine to also increase its supply of fossil fuel and also usage of fossil fuel.
Yeah. Okay, so still looking at agreements that were reached at the COP’29, although the one on fossil fuel is on hold for now, but at least the Article 6 agreement was finalized at COP’29, and it's expected to set rules for global markets to buy and sell carbon credits. What potential do you see from this agreement in the real world, and what expectations do you have from it, especially in terms of reducing global warming in the long run? So what do you think we can expect from this agreement that we saw at COP’29?
Okay, so first of all, I think that there is an issue of standardization when it comes to some of these instruments. Which country standard are we using? Which framework are we using when it comes to standardization? Because when I look at most of the instruments under this Article 6, I realize that most African countries are not going to benefit from it because, as usual, developed countries will use issues of standard and climate accounting to the disadvantage of African countries. And that is why I think that CSOs and CBOs must commit, especially government must also commit a lot of resources in training our people to understand what climate accounting is, so that those of us who may go into methane reduction, agroforestry, and other mitigation measures will do so in understanding how we are going to benefit from some of these instruments under this particular arrangement. Now, if you take the arrangement carefully, it also has a problem because in Africa, most of our businesses are not green businesses. Most of our businesses are not green. Most of them do not even have knowledge of climate change. For example, yesterday, there was a presentation that we did where we asked market women about climate change. And some of them were even believing that climate change is an issue of God. So that issue of divinity, the mindset of many African countries. And when that happens, it becomes very challenging in accessing some of these instruments, or also making utilization of these Article 6 instruments. So we need to educate more based on the CSO level and also CBO level and national level to let our people know that there are certain instruments that if they engage in green businesses, they are going to benefit from, right? And governments must also prioritize agroforestry and other methane reduction activities. For example, in Ghana, every month we have a project called Green Ghana Day, where we plant trees. And in planting these trees, we are able to access some funds from Sweden, Singapore, and another Southeastern Asian country that comes to support us in this green initiative. So when we begin to plant the trees, aggregate already existing trees, and then do better climate accounting, at the end of the day, we are likely going to benefit from some of these trees that are in the Article 6 from COP’27. So we think that lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, and standard set by developed countries are likely going to affect us in achieving some of these climate instruments. I think that we need to educate more of our people on these instruments and how best they can attract what the bankers will call bankable initiatives that can attract some funds or grants to be able to embark on green initiatives in Africa.
All right, thank you so much, Benjamin. So now, Henry, let's come back to you as well. I also want to hear your thoughts on that as well. What do you expect from this Article 6 agreement that was reached, and as well as the fossil fuel phase out that we were speaking about before? I also want to hear your thoughts on this carbon credits. Do you think we as Africans, or as the African country in general, will be able to benefit from this? And if so, how do you think we'll work towards reaching the standard in order to benefit from this agreement? Just your thoughts on that as well.
Well, the carbon market, there's a huge potential for the carbon market, but it requires a lot of planning and public participation. African countries need to do more to invest in creating awareness at the local level, because, like as previously said, the custodians of these natural resources, especially forest, is by indigenous people. Like my institution, we then engaged in biodiversity conservation in local communities. Like Benjamin just said, they tell you that climate change, it has some religious and traditional belief. And some of them are telling us that these things are just theoretical because the scientists are people who do things in the lab and they want to impose on us what they think they have discovered in laboratories. But we've tried somehow, some way to create awareness in local dialects through religious meetings, public participation within the small communities we operate over the last 2, 3, 4 years. And perceptions are changing, but it requires a whole lot more because you see the structure of government in African countries, it goes a long way at the local level, at the district level in some countries before. But the politicians who are the key stakeholders, they have a huge say. Like one of the instances, we went to a community to create awareness through sports and other jamborees. And some politician comes up and say to you that as long as I'm not aware, this thing won't work. So that shows to you that the framework that is to be used in getting the best out of this carbon credit market will start from the lower to the upper level because the indigenous themselves, they have to embrace the idea. They have to be aware of what they are going through, and they also have to see what they are going to benefit and come to a term of agreement. And then we can be able to tap into that market because already, like in West Africa, we have a portion of forest in some part of the West African region, and we can tap into that because we have different sub-regional bodies like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. They have a good portion of the forest in that area called the Mano River Union and other parts of Western Africa towards Central Africa. If these smaller sub-regional bodies can work together, I think we can make a best of it. But we have a long way to go in terms of the carbon credit market, or else we'd just be taking advantage. And on the other hand, locally also, the political will should be there because there were instances there was a pilot project on carbon credits sometimes back in 2009 within the Mano River Union, and there were issue of corruption again. People were giving the farmers who were in that project, they were not giving them what they were to receive, all because the farmers were not aware and the training process needed to go a long way. But those are things we need to look at, but there's a huge potential for Africa, given that we still have some things intact that we can use, like agroforestry, which is also a very important part because in our normal farming systems in Africa, we normally have this slash and burn. But if agroforestry is introduced, the farmers know fully well that these trees provide shade and other benefit to their crops. At the same time, they are also going to get some form of remuneration based on the carbon that has been captured from the atmosphere, the CO2. Thereby, they will be able to manage or sustainably manage their farming at the same time with the hope that they can get something through carbon capture. On the issue of the fossil fuel, we still have a long way to go because bulk of the economies depend on the issue of the export of fuel. So it's more of socio-economic issue and security issue. So for that, I don't want to delve too much into it because we saw the resistance at the COP’29 meetings, and we will still have to talk in the next meetings that are coming up, and they should find a way. Of course, clean energy is better, sustainable energy is better, but what are the incentives that will encourage these things, especially from the higher ups? Are they willing to invest more money? Are they willing to let go of how their economies are being run, heavily reliant on fossil fuel? And that's another subject for another day. But for that, on the issue of fossil fuel, I don't think it's going to be within a reach very soon.
All right. Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much. So let's take a short break now, and coming up next, we'll look into the mixed reactions and dissatisfaction by developing nations. We'll look whether their frustrations are justified, or are they just overlooking their own capacity to take action. So that's when we come back. Don't go anywhere. Thank you for staying with us. You're still watching the special coverage of COP'29 on Green Growth TV. Before the break, we examined the global commitments from COP'29. Now, I want to shift our focus to the dissatisfaction voiced by developing nations. Let me still stay with you, and Henry, I want to hear your thoughts on that. Without a doubt, a lot of people expressed a lot of dissatisfaction. Some even said they felt betrayed. Even at the COP, we saw a couple of people walk out from the negotiation process and all of that. So there was a lot of sense of disappointment from developing nations at COP'29. So, but the question now is, do you think it's justified? Because some people may ask that, are they just feeling entitled? Because a lot of people are saying, oh, why are they, they are demanding this much from the global north? Is it that they can't do anything by themselves? So we just want to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think this disappointment is justified, or are they feeling entitled, or are these grievances actually a reflection of the systemic inequalities? Or is there more that even the developing nations themselves could have done to help themselves in this particular situation? Just your thoughts on the reactions by different developing nations all over the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Regards to the reactions by most of the developing countries, I think it's just an outburst of the systematic inequalities that these developing nations have experienced over the decades, if not centuries. That can also be traced back to the issue of IMF and the loans that are given to these African countries. If you look at how the loans agreements are made and how they are entered into, it shows that somebody has been strangulated for too long, and they see this as a public display to put out their anger out there. In terms of even the amount that has been given out, Africans were saying they needed more than that because they feel like they are always the victim. But we need to do more, because we cannot continue. Like, look at most of our national budgets in African countries. You find out that most of the budgets, most of the items are hinged around grants and loans, which is not very sustainable for us, or else we keep running back to the same old thing. It's like you're putting water into a fishing net, you won't get anything to be kept in there. I think that's the situation. So I think it's high time that our regional bodies in Africa, like the AU, like ECOWAS, SADC, East African communities, and the Sahel regions, it's time that we put our feet to the ground. And because if you look at the COP issue, it's also related to the Sustainable Development Goals and African Agenda 2063. So we cannot have our own agenda and then tie it to other people's own personal interest. So I think it's where African politicians and our policy makers will need to draw between the line and know where we need to stand. We need to be, to some extent, independent, so that we'll be able to achieve something that suits our own context, so to speak, or else it's going to be like that forever, or so to speak, because we have to draw the line. And I think, to the greater extent, in my own opinion, our politicians, our representatives who are going to these meetings, I think they are not really looking at the bigger picture, but in most cases, they are looking at things for the immediate effect. But in the long run, we have to do more than what we are doing.
All right. So Benjamin, now looking at the final outcome of this COP’29 and the conclusions that we came to. I mean, the whole point of this, or I mean, one of the most important things, the reason why we have this is to keep the global temperature rise below the 1.5 degrees Celsius. But looking at the outcome of COP’29 and, you know, some of the, should we say, ignorance on certain parts, do you feel that the commitment to keep global temperature rise below the 1.5 degrees Celsius is still alive, or is it becoming a fading ambition? Do you even think that we can still achieve that anytime soon? What radical shifts do we need to close in order to make sure that we close this gap and we reach this goal? Or do you think that has just become an utopian dream at this point? What's your thoughts on that?
That we can achieve it. We are still around 50-50 ability to achieve it and not ability to achieve it, which is 50-50 at par. I think that, as I indicated earlier, the global north is not committed. But if African countries and other developing, in quote, countries put their policies, very pragmatic policies of mitigating and also targeting some of these emission reductions by 2030, we are likely going to drop some of these temperatures that we are talking about. Because if you look at COP’27, the projection was below 2%, and maybe at a benchmark of 1.5%. But in the long run, also depends on our ability to achieve our own targets at the regional and constituency level. I think that if African countries are able to achieve their targets within the specific time frame in their NDCs, we can use that to force developed countries to also achieve their target, and that collaborates and within partnership brings these temperature down. Now, if you look at the developed nations, I even think that we need to conduct certain research to find out how the Russia-Ukraine war is also impacting temperature rises, because these are nuclear ammunitions and other ammunitions being dropped on the daily basis. There's Hezbollah and then Israel conflict, and these are also ammunitions being dropped daily, impacting the environment or the environmental space and impacting sustainable cities. So all these have certain impact on temperature variations or temperature variability. But I think that if African countries and other developing countries, especially those in Latin America, are able to achieve our targets within our specified NDCs, we can use that to force the developed countries to achieve this particular target. And the last part also is that when Henry mentioned about the contribution, I was just looking at the GDP of America. America's GDP is around $28 trillion. Now, $28 trillion, imagine America allocates only 1% of that GDP to climate change, which is within the Sustainable Development Goal. It means that America is contributing about $28 billion annually to Africa, just America alone. China does about 18 trillion. Imagine China contributes 1% of its GDP. China is doing, that is about $18 billion. So all these countries with higher GDPs, higher economies that have been emitting a lot at the disadvantage of African countries who do not emit much, can also contribute their way for us to achieve this 1.5 minus degree that we are talking about. So it depends on the ability of the global north or the advanced countries to contribute their quota with respect to this particular financing arrangement that has been agreed upon, to contribute a lot. When that happens, it means that African countries will be able to mitigate, reduce further our emissions, which is already low, and then force these developed countries to also reduce their emissions. And I think that we must not go there with a losing posture. I think most of our ministers and government agencies who attend some of these conferences go there with a loose posture. We must demand from them. If American government can contribute $60 billion to Ukraine to fight, or other countries are contributing to Russia to fight, then it behoves on them to also contribute to Africa to mitigate some of these and also adapt to some of these climate change variability issues that are affecting us. And when that happens, I think that most of these countries will be able to reduce and then bring this temperature down. The last part also is that newer technologies in the green space will also help us. Newer technologies within the green space, which are very, very affordable, will also transit a lot of countries from the fossil fuel as we have, which is a major contributor of emissions, to new areas that emits less. We must also look at how we can also promote green agriculture across the world, not only in Africa, because in Africa, for example, in Ghana, I was just looking at the data in Nigeria where energy sector contributes a lot of GHG. But in Ghana, we have what you call agroforestry and other land use that contributes about 54%. So it means that the way we do our agriculture in Ghana also emits low. There are other countries in Africa that also does certain agriculture which are not sustainable. We have to have a way of having sustainable agriculture in Africa. And the more we become very sustainable in our crop production, I think that also will contribute to some of these temperature reductions. But at the end of the day, the ball still stands at the court of advanced countries because they produce more GHGs. And if they are able to reduce their GHGs, which must be forced on them by African countries, I think that we'll be able to reduce the temperature by 1.5 based on the specified date.
All right. So just before we wrap up, looking at the mixed results of COP’29, do you think that COP is still fulfilling its purpose, or it can still in the future fulfill its purpose? Because now it seems like a lot of people have lost hope in the UNFCCC's conference, so there's just a lot of talks that, what's the point of this COP, because it seems as though we're not getting what we need at every point in time. So I also want to know if you have that feeling. Do you think that all the global climate talks can achieve any meaningful action, or are they too slow and maybe even too cumbersome to reach where we want to reach? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that hope is not lost, and we should continue to engage in some of these talks and negotiations. At the end of the day, building consensus and partnering to resolve our problem is the key thing. We need that global stage to be able to negotiate and build a certain consensus. But as I indicated earlier, it also must come from African countries with strong and determination to force these advanced countries to reduce these emissions. We shouldn't go there thinking that they are doing us a favor. I think most of the time we think they are doing us a favor and we go with a loose posture. We must not go there with a loose posture. We must feel strongly that it is their corporate social responsibility to help us because they emit a lot and we suffer the consequences of their emissions. That is one. Now, the second part is that African countries, within the 2063 framework or within the Sustainable Development Goal framework, must also begin to implement some of these NDCs that they've set for their specific countries. I believe that implementation of these NDCs and achieving various targets, whether business as usual or unconventional targets, I think that achieving them also gives us an upper hand in terms of making our case in some of these conferences. And also we must reduce corruption in the utilization of some of these funds from developed countries, because one of the reasons why most of these countries do not respect us and think that allocation of their resources to us will not inure to their benefit is that they think that corruption steals most of these grants that they allocate to us. African countries must also deal with this particular issue of corruption and ensure that there's transparency in the utilization of grants that come from climate action or climate initiatives across the globe. And I also think that, as I indicated, and Henry also said the same, we must educate our people to understand the issue of climate change. Educating them to understand this particular issue helps them to become very sustainable in terms of all the practices that we may need, in terms of architecture, building, in terms of forestry, in terms of environmental management, in terms of mining, which is a major issue in Africa, unsustainable mining in the Congos, in Nigeria, in Ghana. We must have that particular platform to educate. So when we begin to be green, very green, then it gives us that upper hand to make a case well with these developed countries. And these developing countries must also abide by some of these arrangements. So I think that we need set global stages to put out discussions, build consensus, and see the way forward. Because if we stop this COVID, it means that we don't have anything to look upon, and countries may begin to do whatever they want, and that also goes to affect our future and sustainability, and maybe not us, but our grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren that may come in future. They are going to suffer it, and that is not sustainable. That is very, very unsustainable for the future of our kids.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. So also, finally, let me come to you, Henry, as well. Still on that topic, do you think that COP in its current form is still effective and it can still fulfill its purpose even in the long run? What do you also hold as regards that line of thoughts?
Yes, indeed. It is achievable, it is possible. In fact, when it comes to the issue of the reduction of the temperature below 1.5% degrees Celsius, I think Africa can set a standard. Normally, people are asking questions, can anything good come out of Africa? And I believe that Africa can take the lead, set the standard, reduce this global temperature by less than 1.5, and then we can be a leader in this way, so that by the time we are moving towards the next 5-6 conferences, instead of us then like walking away in dissatisfaction, people will be running to us because we'll be a good role model to others to follow. Because instead of being dissatisfied all of the time, this is the action we can take. We have the advantage. Our emission rates are still low compared to other parts of the world. Of course, there are some instances. Then if we set these standards, it becomes a working standard for the meetings and the conferences in the future to come. But this can also be achieved through our national policies. You see, most of the African countries, except for few of them, had concrete working document to show a case. But if we have good amount of these in our national policies at the local level, then they are enshrined within our agenda, within our national budget. It's reflecting. It becomes easier for us to implement most of these climate smart agriculture, sustainable program, the rest of it, agroecological things, because these are the things that are coming of agroecology. But if you check most of our African, our national policies on agriculture and forest management, you already find these things there. But we go to these meetings, these are the things that are coming up. So I think somewhere along the line, there's a missing link, and we need to fit in a gap, because this thing is about our future, the future of our children, the future of Africa, or else we will be singing the song on the negative side, and which of course we don't want to live in our old age seeing such a thing happening. But the future is bright when it comes to Africa taking the lead in reducing global warming. We have the potential, we have what it takes. It's only left with the willpower of our people. And most importantly, we are leaving something out. I think we'll talk about it more of the politicians, but our academicians, they are not to some extent doing us fair in terms of research and development. If you will bear with me, the more like, to some extent, I feel, in my own opinion, most of our academicians are even more corrupt than the politicians. But the only thing is that academicians are not audited like government officials. So you don't see, look at most of the projects that come in academia. How many funds have not been put into academia? But most of the projects, the output, the outcome are driven towards the donors instead of the ordinary people. And that's why you will agree with me also that most of our farmers, most of our indigenous people, they don't understand most of the things that come up in environment, in health, public health issues. Funds have been put into academia, but some researcher somewhere make the name, he gets promotion, he or she gets promoted. We have supervised 15,000 students, what have you, they get the millions of dollars, but the trickle-down effect is never felt in Africa. So I think it's hard time we also streamline our research and academic programs so that it can fall in line with the context of the local people instead of meeting the need or the expectation of the donors. I submit.
All right, thank you so much, Henry, and thank you, Benjamin, also for joining us on the program. It's a pleasure to have you Well, COP'29 has been quite a journey that we have also judiciously followed through. COP'29 has left us with mixed emotions, progress in some areas, but of course, serious ambition gaps in others. From the 300 billion climate finance deal to debates on defining developing nations, and of course, the lukewarm engagement on phasing out fossil fuels, this COP has reviewed the complexities of global climate negotiations. And without a doubt, the road ahead to COP30 in Brazil is very high on stakes. As we continue this journey towards a sustainable future, let's not lose sight of the urgency of climate action and the responsibility we all share in holding our leaders accountable. Many thanks for joining Green Growth TV on this special COP'29 edition journey. Do stick around as we continue to push and amplify the conversations that matter, holding leaders accountable, especially towards sustainable solutions. Thank you so much for joining. I am Tony Ogubanjo. Till next time.